I had a friend recently who said to me, not in a mean way or anything, but she said, "You talk about Jesus like he's all that. Like he's all that." I hope it's never lost on us how in the minds of the smart people, the religious people, the good people, the popular people, Jesus wasn't just some eccentric. He was a criminal. Yeah, reckoned so despicable as to deserve death. Not merely death, but the worst kind of death the world had yet thought of. Yeah, he's all that. He was sentenced to die in a manner so terrible as to be illegal for a Roman citizen. He was sentenced to die in a way too terrible for an animal, but not for a slave, and especially not for a traitor. And that's what they thought of him. A traitor to the faith. A traitor to everything that had been. Yep, he's all that. If he had been spared the cross, if Pilate had had the guts to stand up to the insane crowds, he likely would have died that night anyway. After all, he'd been whipped 39 times. Twice, with bone-embedded leather, the Romans sliced into his flesh 78 times, when 40 lashes were considered a death sentence. In similar recorded beatings, human organs were visible. So if he'd been spared the cross, Jesus likely would have eventually died that night of blood loss or infection or shock, but he wasn't spared the cross. No, first he was made to wear a crown of thorns, drilled cruelly into his skull as soldiers pounded his head with reeds. The crown was meant to mock the man some hoped would reign as a king in Judea. And it mocked the man some are calling the King of the Jews. I wonder if any of them said, "Jesus, you think you're all that?" Jesus explained how his kingdom was not of this world, but few comprehended such a kingdom. Most of them never would. Now, this one thought blows my mind. Jesus could have called a battalion of angels to free him, when one lone angel was enough to slay 120,000 soldiers from the army of the toughest empire of the time. But Jesus didn't do that. Instead, he put his own cross on his shoulder. Imagine if they knew what they were doing. Those crowds, those priests, those politicians. Most didn't. And Jesus called for them to be forgiven. So yeah, Jesus is all that. What's more, he wasn't the first to be accused of crimes he didn't commit. He wasn't the first to be judged unfairly by those who felt their power threatened. He was hardly the first to be tortured and mocked and brutalized at the whims of a foolish, fickle crowd. And he wasn't the first to be crushed beneath the thumb of a powerful but temporary empire and at the hands of professional soldiers who were just doing their job. No, And he wasn't the first to be nailed to a cross. Decades earlier, the Romans lined the Appian Way near Rome with 6,000 such crucifixions. Truth be told, Jesus' execution was just one of thousands of executions, and it seemed almost ordinary in a world of ordinary horrors. The cross, that one cross among thousands of crosses, seemed unremarkable in an unremarkable hell. But there's a reason why only one crucifixion is called the crucifixion. And there's a reason why only one cross is called the cross. And there's a reason why only one death brings such hope to funeral after funeral after funeral. That's because on that cross hung the same God whose spirit hovered over the waters, who looked out on a dark void and said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Now that same God teetered over another kind of darkness and said, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." That's because on that cross hung the same God who spoke to Moses through a burning bush and said of himself, "I am is who I am. Tell them I am sent you." Now that same God said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's because on that cross hung the same God who walked with Adam and Eve in Eden. Now that same God said to a known terrorist, "Surely I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." And on that cross hung the same God who rained down a torrent of water to flood the entire planet, reaching the tops of the topmost mountains. Now that same God said, "I thirst." And that's also because on that cross hung the same God who had split the Red Sea with air from his nostrils, and yet now suffocated slowly, his bones and organs pressing up against his lungs. This was no ordinary death. This was the death of God's Son, a perfect lamb slain before the foundation of the world. Stop for a moment and think of that moment, a brief but vital moment in the whole universe, when the creator of the world whispered, "It is finished." And while no one there could have possibly known what he meant, all was indeed finished. And then stop for a moment and think of the dreaded quiet the planet must have felt. What the few believers felt as sorrow, anguish, and loss was nothing to what the universe felt, to what the angels felt, to what the Father felt. Then stop for a moment and think of the terror the followers of Jesus must have felt. Fear for their lives, of course, but far worse, fear that everything they believed in had died with him. Yet that terror was nothing to what the devil himself would feel early Sunday morning when the stone began to move. And he wasn't the first to walk out of a tomb. Lazarus had done so, obeying the words of Jesus. And Moses long ago had done so. But there's a reason why this resurrection is called the resurrection. Because out from that tomb walked the same God who had said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Because out of that tomb walked the same God who said, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and now whoever believes in him will have life, everlasting life. That's because out of that tomb walked the same God who said, let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God? Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms, and I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come again so that you can be with me. That's right, Jesus, he is all that. Because Jesus is alive and the tomb is empty, resurrections still happen every day in the hearts and lives of those who believe. And so it continues. Every day the lost are found, the blind see, addicts overcome, abusers are transformed, the vilest convicts, molesters, murderers, rapists, doubters, haters, gossipers are restored into something utterly beautiful, and all by claiming the power of the God who walked out of that tomb. For you see, Jesus has won, and he's alive. The grave could not hold him, and death and defeat must surrender its crown, and that old cross that was meant to shame him instead goes down in history as the boldest exclamation to punctuate how he has won. Therefore, we have won. And he, my friends, is all that. See you soon, buddy. See you very soon. Because Jesus has won. He has won, and he's all that.